textbooks quoted the Bible and used it as part of the alphabet, and earlier Supreme Court cases ruled that a school must teach religion and the Bible. Therefore, on what possible basis can the 1963 court justify its ruling to stop the use of the Bible in schools? The court always explains its decision in written form. That 1963 case was no different. If you go to a law library and examine the text of that decision, you will find why the Bible had to be removed from school. In its written decision, the court noted that, quote, if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. Now that's quite a statement. For the second time in a year, this was a case lacking both historical and legal precedent. Again, the court simply made a new announcement of policy: no more Bible reading in schools. The courts continued to extend the new boundary outward. In 1965, in the case Reed v. Van Hoven, the court determined that it was possible for students to pray over their lunch at school so long as no one knew they were praying. They couldn't say words or move their lips, but they could pray if no one knew about it. In 1967, in DeKalb v. Despain, the court took a 4-line nursery rhyme used by a K-5 kindergarten class and declared that nursery rhyme unconstitutional. The court explained that although the word God was not contained in this nursery rhyme, if someone were to hear the rhyme, they might think that it was talking about God, and that would be unconstitutional. This trend continued in case after case, year after year. In 1 year alone, 3 cases made the courts challenging the right of students to see copies of the Ten Commandments while at school. The Supreme Court accepted the Stone v. Graham case from Kentucky, where a copy of the Ten Commandments was hanging in the hallways of the schools. The court acknowledged that the Ten Commandments were passive displays. That is, they simply hung on the walls just like a picture of George Washington. They were not part of any class or any curriculum. They just hung there. A student could look at them if he wanted to, and if he didn't, fine. Yet notice the court's ruling under the redefined First Amendment. The court said, if the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible objective. That's quite a statement. You can't let kids see the Ten Commandments because if they do, they might obey them. Things like don't steal, don't kill, and that would be unconstitutional. When the court declares something unconstitutional, it is inferring that our founding fathers, the men who drafted the Constitution, would have opposed it. Yet notice what James Wilson had to say about this. James Wilson was a signer of the Constitution, an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, and co-author of America's first commentaries on the Constitution. Certainly he's qualified to speak to the intent of the Constitution, and he explained, human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other. The divine law forms an essential part of both. Our founders were clear about the important and inseparable role that religious principles played in the public life of the nation. The entire controversy over God and religious activities and teachings in school had begun with the 22-word prayer in the Engel Vital case. That 22-word prayer, the prayer that led to the removal of all prayers from America's schools, simply said, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That prayer, which only acknowledged God and didn't even contain the word Jesus, was a bland prayer. It was so bland that 8 years later, when a court was discussing that prayer, it described that prayer as a, quote, to whom it may concern prayer. That bland prayer acknowledged God only once. That one acknowledgement of God is the same number of times that God is acknowledged in the Pledge of Allegiance and only 1/4 the number of times that God is acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence. Yet it was unconstitutional. Since this simple prayer acknowledged God, the court went so far as to find out what percentage of the nation did believe in God. In the 1963 case, Aberdeen v. Shemp, the court reported that only 3% of the nation professed no belief in religion, no belief in God. 97% of the nation believed in God. That prayer was consistent with the beliefs of 97%. Nonetheless, the court took another first. It sided with the 3% against the 97%. This was the first time in America's history that 3% had become a majority. 3% had always been a minority, but now the philosophy of the 3% would be the philosophy under which the 97% must conduct its affairs. The 4 categories in that prayer which petitioned God's blessing were students, families, schools, and the nation. There are numbers of court cases readily available which show that until 1962-63, the courts consistently ruled using biblical principles and following biblical guidelines in all 4 of those areas. For example, In the area of families, even in 20th century divorce cases, a court explained that divorce was allowed for very few reasons, and that the reason was because the Bible allowed very few reasons. The court pointed out that it had not made the family, God had. Therefore, it didn't have a right to regulate something it had not made. The courts even went into a Bible lesson. It explained that in the beginning, God had made Adam and Eve. God made the first family, and then the court continued through a history of God's dealings with the family, concluding that since it was God who had created the family, the court would use His rules in dealing with it. The same policy not only held with the court's rulings on families, but also in the court's rulings on the nation, schools, and students as well. But in 1962-63, the Supreme Court reversed that position and announced that those rules and policies caused, quote, psychological damage. Did the court's decision to change national policy and to separate God's principles from its rulings have any effect? Let's examine each of the four categories, beginning with students. That which occurred with students following the removal of religious principles was perfectly predicted by George Washington in his farewell address when he said, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Washington warned that to remove religious principles would be to lose national morality. Notice the accuracy of his warning. This chart shows pregnancies for unwed girls ages 15 through 19. For decades prior to 1962-63, birth rates for unwed teen girls had remained relatively stable. However, with the court's separation of religious principles from students, birth rates for unwed girls have now increased every year since 1962-63. This chart represents pregnancies for high school girls, but even birth rates for girls 10 through 14 years old have increased 553% since the removal of religious principles. This is a strong correlation. Perhaps it's merely coincidental, but it is both complete and striking. It is further significant to note that every moral measurement which exists for students breaks violently upward with the separation of religious principles from the lives of students in 1962-63. Notice this category: sexually transmitted diseases to high school students. Notice how low sexually transmitted diseases had been. Notice the point when religious principles were prohibited. Notice a dramatic increase. The same is true for every moral measurement among youth. Again, each of these categories was showing overall declines prior to 1962-63, but with the first ever separation of religious principles from students, a violent upturn occurred on every chart and in every moral measurement. Washington was correct. The next category over which God was acknowledged in that simple prayer, and in which the courts had maintained the use of biblical principles prior to 1962, was that of our families, or our parents. What happened when we abandoned the use of God's principles when dealing with families? Consider the area of divorce. Statistically, the divorce rate had been steadily declining for years and even decades prior to 1962-63. Beginning in 1963, the divorce rate skyrocketed. The United States has now become #1 in the world in the rate of divorce. It is again striking that every measurement related to the breakup of the family statistically skyrocketed in 1963 with the separation of biblical principles from public policy. Single-parent families are now up 140%. Single-parent families with children are now up 160%. Even family morality is dramatically different. Unmarried couples living together are now up 536%. Again, each of these categories had been stable for years prior to 1962-63, and then the dramatic increases correlate exactly to the court's rejection of those standards which had been applied to the family for 170 years previously. The third category in which God's assistance was petitioned was our schools. What happened when we barred God and His principles from our schools? The SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, is an excellent indicator. The SAT test has been in America since 1926, and in 1941 it was placed on the same scale that is still used today. Prior to 1963, there were never more than 2 consecutive years where the scores either rose or declined. But beginning in 1963, scores plummeted for 18 consecutive years. Unprecedented. Scores are now so low that the Department of Education states that this is the first time in America's history that we are graduating out a generation of students who academically know less than their parents did. The SAT test is the same test their parents used. It's been the same since 1941, yet there is nearly an 80-point difference between the two generations. In 1962, there were only 1,000 Christian schools in the nation, but once it became obvious that things like prayer, Bible, and the Ten Commandments would be forbidden, there was a marked explosion in the number of religious and particularly Christian schools. By 1984,